Hello everyone, and welcome to a brief history of journalism in America. This is going to be the slowest part of the video, so let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover. First off on our journey, we're going to go all the way back to 1690, when the very first American newspaper, Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, was published. Only problem was it only lasted one issue, but it was a good head start. Alright, we won't really see things take off until 1791 when the Bill of Rights was passed. The Bill of Rights included the First Amendment. It's a really long amendment, but what I want us to focus on is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Abridging basically meaning restricting. It was a huge step forward, basically telling everyone that you could not prevent anything that the press was trying to say. Our next big update comes about 50 years later in 1849. We had a group of publishers start an organization to bring news from Europe. It would eventually go on to become the Associated Press. Started originally from 6 news sources, but today it covers over 1,700 newspapers and 5,000 different TV and radio stations. So it's a big organization. We get lots of our news from there. Now this is one of our famous figures. In 1883 we have Joseph Pulitzer, who buys the New York World from Jay Gould for $346,000. Joseph Pulitzer, you might know him as the creator of the Pulitzer Prize. He also invented sensationalism, exaggerating news or gory details. If you think he looks like Shia LaBeouf in about 50 years, I'd agree with you. About 10 years later, in 1895, we have this guy, William Randolph Hearst, who would go on to become Joseph Pulitzer's biggest rival in the news industry. Buys the New York Morning Journal, renames it the New York Journal, and converts it to a penny paper. Now, if you notice the bags under his eyes, it's from all the basic lies that he was telling. He and Joseph Pulitzer were kind of the inventors of yellow journalism, stories that were only half true, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. Yellow journalism, like I said, are stories that are typically only half true. They tend to sensationalize things or make things into a bigger deal than they actually are. One big example of this was where Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst both blamed Spain for a mysterious explosion that sank the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, Cuba. That helped push the United States into war with Spain. The only problem was there was no really proof that Spain did this. So it's cited as a huge example of yellow journalism. Now, at about this time, and during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, we have the introduction of these people called muckrakers. Oftentimes, they were investigative journalists who were simply trying to get to the bottom of a story. Here, the example that we have is with Teddy Roosevelt, who is scraping through muck, all the dirt and nastiness and mud, to reveal a meat scandal. Upton Sinclair, one of my favorite journalists, he was the guy that exposed this infamous meat scandal where basically all these unsanitary, disgusting conditions were being used to create and pack meat. His investigative journalism resulted in a huge uprising and a complete overhaul of how we pack meat. Now, the term muckraker comes from Teddy Roosevelt, who said it and meant it as an insult, but they kind of took the name and made it their own, agreeing that yes, they do rake through the mud because they are trying to get down to the truth at the nasty bottom. Now, up to this point in time, radio had been gaining popularity, so in 1934, the U.S. increased regulation of broadcasting with the founding of the Federal Communications Commission, also known as the FCC, so, good job, guys. Ooh, okay, now y'all ready for some hot tea? So you guys probably don't recognize this building, but it is known as the infamous Watergate Hotel. In 1971, the Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein cover a burglary at the offices of the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C.'s Watergate Hotel. They eventually link the break-in to a dirty tricks campaign led by advisors to President Richard Nixon, whose attempts to cover up the misdeeds led to his own resignation in 1974. Basically, what had happened was Richard Nixon was a little bit worried about his election that was coming up and was afraid that he wouldn't be reelected, and so they were going to fool the polls. And yes, this is Richard Nixon here, the famous peace sign president guy. He also did the whole "I am not a crook" line. Now, as I said before, because of this whole investigation, he did eventually resign, but it was a fantastic example of investigative journalism on the parts of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Now we're skipping forward to the 1970s and 80s when the Vietnam War was going on. Now the Vietnam War was the first televised war. While other wars had been reported on and had pictures taken of them in the past, the Vietnam War was the first war where live images were being broadcast on television in people's homes, so it made a big deal. Because of that, it reinforced the idea that war is hell. And because of that, not a whole lot of people liked the Vietnam War. A lot of them actually protested, which eventually, combined with several defeats that we faced, caused us to retreat from Vietnam. And now we jump forward to 1994 with public awareness of the World Wide Web, also known as the Internet. The information superhighway awakens with news coverage of its potential. This is also when Yahoo opens. It's also the time that we get cool blue fingers and a bunch of ones and zeros that somehow indicate code and that something is happening on the screen. Up next we have the other infamous story, September 11th, 2001. This was the attack on the Twin Towers in New York City, New York. Thousands died, and even millions more were affected by this, if not directly, simply by the fact that this was an attack on our home country. It was something that was unexpected to the general public, and even though those jet fuel can't melt steel beams memes might be funny, there's something that you can't deny, and that is the fact that 9/11 changed the face of journalism. It changed the way that we report stories and our values, the way we look at stories. It's something that affects journalism even today. Now, as we finish up, 2012, the digital revolution at this point has fostered a mobile age. People are connected wherever they are. There's Wi-Fi hotspots everywhere. There's a Starbucks on every corner, for goodness sakes. Half of American adults own a smartphone, and a quarter of Americans own a tablet. Cars have internet connections. Mobility enables news consumption, which boosts journalism. Access to news is easy 24/7 with devices in people's pockets and laps, and on their desks, and even their kitchen tables. Meanwhile, mobile platforms and social media channels are additional technology layers for news organizations to accommodate. Some giant technology firms that use news are Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, all working to help people consolidate their digital lives and bring people together. That is the conclusion of our video. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you.